Got a few quick-fire questions for you,
Okay.
quick-fire round. Should we be hearing more from Biden in the face of Trump's election claims? Has he stayed too quiet?
No, he's handling it just right.
Well, I told you quick-fire, so I won't ask you to elaborate. Is it more important to hold the Trump administration accountable or to correct course swiftly?
Well, for Biden, probably the latter. For the country overall, the former has to be on the agenda. I mean, you can't have a lack of accountability.
Will the Trumps continue to be a viable force in politics?
Really interesting question. I think less so than most people believe today.
You don't think he's going to try to start a news network or continue his rallies?
Let me tell you something. If it comes to Donald Trump's news network versus Rupert Murdoch, I know where I'm betting.
On Rupert Murdoch?
Yes.
Okay. Are Democrats still the party of the blue-collar worker?
Not nearly enough. They went and Joe Biden was the perfect blue-collar candidate, right? And if you look at a place like Pennsylvania, a state where he was born, he did slightly better than Hillary Clinton in those northeastern and those western counties, but not much. He carried Pennsylvania again because of the college-educated suburbs.
Is it too late to shield our country's workers from automation?
Boy, thank God this is a lightning round because you will probably exhaust my knowledge in about 4.7 seconds. It's both inevitable. Automation is both inevitable, and there's going to be a tremendous a premium on figuring out how we work around it. But something, we always work around it. I remember when I graduated from high school many, many years ago, we went over to a friend's house and his father was a very conservative businessman. And this was back in I show my age now, 1960. And he said, let me tell you something, you kids have no future because labor unions are taking over America and America will never be the prosperous country it's been for the last 15 years. Yeah, sure. Thanks. So we'll figure out a workaround. We'll figure out, a new way. I'm not confident. I'm worried about the short term, but not the long term.
If the House and Senate end up split, who should we look to for compromise?
Well, you see it already.
Usual
You see the
suspects.
Manchins and the Collins, right? And, Mitt Romney will be involved in some of this. And, it's going to be difficult. If they end up split, if Georgia goes with two Republicans, it's going to be a real challenge for Joe Biden.
Okay, so we'll pull out of this lightning round because when I opened the show, I talked a little bit about Capital Gang and about the days as I was prepping for today's episode. I was kind of looking back at shows like Capital Gang, shows like your show with Robert Novak, and looking at how through the 80s and the 90s, and even a little bit into the early part of 2000s, there were a lot more shows on cable news that had people on both sides of the aisle talking about issues, arguing about them. I mean, you got into plenty of fights with Robert Novak on TV, but presumably, at least you convinced us, you didn't hate each other, and you were able to disagree vehemently.
I'll go much further than that. I miss him, all the time.
So
we didn't agree on anything. We didn't agree on politics, taxes, politicians, basketball, the weather. But God, we had a great time together. And I learned from him, and he may have had a hard time admitting it, but he may have learned one or two things from me.
A few things. But you could see that on TV, that even when people disagreed, they were able to get along and laugh at the end of an episode and still be friends. And that happened throughout the 90s and early into the 2000s. Capital Gang and Crossfire went away at the same time. Around about the same time, by the way, that Hannity and Combs were no longer together and it just became Hannity instead. And then CNN tried to bring back Crossfire in the mid-teens, and it didn't last but for 10 minutes. And I can't help but wonder if that was sort of the period of time when people stopped being willing to listen to folks get along. Have we, and even you now do, as we've talked about, you have a show, a podcast here with James Carville, who really needs no introduction either. Politics War Room with James Carville and Al Hunt. If you're listening and you haven't listened to that, I really recommend it. But
Thank
even
you.
shows like that, or this one, where we had intended to do a show with people from both sides of the aisle trying to have thoughtful discussion, even we had to kind of distance ourselves from that because we found that there were not many times when we could get a Republican and a Democrat to come on together one-on-one and have a discussion. You do your show with James, who's obviously shares a lot of, you disagree on some things, but you share a lot of the same viewpoints.
Right.
Why aren't we doing that? Why aren't people willing to sit down and talk to each other anymore?
Well, I mean, I think I'm going to be parochial here. I think that my wife's show, the PBS NewsHour, certainly does that.
Right.
But I think that the commercial
But
television,
not for ratings.
no, that's right. And I think for what cable news has found is that basically you go and you play to your audience. And when you play to your audience, you don't worry about having the other side told. And now occasionally they'll tell the other side, but it's just a whole different political, cultural, and social landscape than it was 20 years ago.
Hey, I'm Clay Aiken. To hear the full episode, subscribe to this Politicon podcast on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, or wherever you listen to pods. Please subscribe, rate, and review the show. Go to Politicon.com, follow @Politicon on social media, and listen to a new pod episode of How the Heck every Thursday.